Hi, this is Laura, and here's my presentation on prima facie duties and ethical standards. The primary theorist for prima facie duties is W.D. Ross, and he was a British philosopher at Oxford. What came to be before prima facie duties, as you all are learning, is the variety of theories that are singular or absolutist, and of course then out of that came ethical pluralism, and then W.D. Ross built on that and came up with prima facie duties, which for many of you is probably a little bit more comfortable in terms of moral theory than some of the other ones. W.D. Ross was familiar with forms of utilitarian thinking. He understood Kant. He was not satisfied, as I mentioned, with either theory, but recognized that there were correct principles in each. And the deontological duty theory he developed in the 1930s combined aspects of utilitarian and Kant thinking and was very influential. So this theory tries to basically take the best of the prior theories. The ethics of prima facie duties. Now keep in mind we've had various discussions in the course up to this point about absolutist theories. This is a non-absolutist version of ethical pluralism, which means that there's more than one way of looking at moral obligations or moral duties or what is right or wrong. A prima facie duty is an excellent, permanent, non-absolute reason to do or refrain from doing something. And in Ross's view, we have many prima facie duties. Each is fundamental, and each can be outweighed by competing reasons on any particular occasion. So the list of prima facie duties: reparations, gratitude, justice, beneficence, self-improvement, fidelity, and non-maleficence. And in general, when you put these all together, it is all about doing good. So repairing harm, acknowledging what others have done for us through gratitude, ensuring that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished, enhancing or expanding virtue, self-improvement, so making people better or encouraging people to become more intelligent or virtuous. Fidelity is keeping our promises, being truthful, and non-maleficence is preventing harm to others. So one of the other things that we're studying at this time that I'm going to bring in to my presentation is the CAS Statement of Shared Ethical Principles. These align very well with the prima facie duties. And you'll see not exactly the same, but very similar, and some are the same title. So autonomy, non-malfeasance, beneficence, justice, fidelity, veracity, and affiliation. Some of the ones that are a little bit different for us to consider: that we actively promote connected relationships among all people and foster community. So that is the affiliation. So veracity is similar to one of the prima facie duties in that we want to convey truth. Fidelity is our obligation to be trustworthy or to fulfill our duties. And non-malfeasance, we pledge to do no harm. That's similar to the other that we saw. And autonomy is we do take responsibility for our actions. So hopefully as you study during these this week and so on for prima facie duties and the CAS Statement of Shared Ethical Principles, these will help inform your own code of ethics that you're working on, but also they will feel, again, like many common things that we see in our work and personal lives. So here's just a quick matchup between prima facie and CAS ethical standards: self-improvement and autonomy. This is a focus on individual behavior. Reparations, non-maleficence, and non-malfeasance is a focus on doing no harm. Gratitude and beneficence is focusing on doing and recognizing good. They match it pretty well for justice, so focusing on equality and fairness, and fidelity and veracity, which are focused on truth and obligation. And then you have the one I mentioned, affiliation, which is a focus on community. So here are some of the outcomes for these types of ethical principles. And what do you think about these as you listen to this presentation and study in these weeks about these ethical concepts? When professionals act in accordance with ethical principles, program quality and excellence are enhanced, and ultimately individuals are better served. And that is one of the goals of prima facie duties, is that we are to improve and make things better. As professionals providing services in education, we're committed to upholding these shared ethical principles for the benefit of our students, our professions, and our education. So the advantages of prima facie, it accommodates a sense that there is more than a single fundamental ethical consideration. So keep in mind, related to the absolutist version, this is the non-absolute version, that there can be more than one fundamental ethical consideration. And prima facie explains why we are sometimes permitted to break the moral rules, because they are non-absolute. It explains the existence of moral conflict, and we'll talk about that here in a second. What happens when some of these duties conflict? Focusing on natural intuitive tendencies: be good, do no harm, be honest, connect with others. So this is a little bit more of a intuitive feeling type of moral theory that, again, you may feel more comfortable with because it resonates in the way that you behave naturally. Explains why regret is sometimes appropriate even when one has done nothing wrong. Now, prima facie versus other theories, it does offer us more than perhaps utilitarian or Kantian theories. And so utilitarians usually have to say when an action produces greatest happiness, it is right, even if it is harmful. And Kant's theory must often say that lying is wrong, even if it can be beneficial. So these are some of the absolutist theories where prima facie might give us an avenue towards moral thinking and acting without actually violating a fundamental rule. So here's an example. Ross's theory has been most useful for helping medical professionals, educators, social workers, and business people to understand basic moral principles that apply in their practices, and then also how to make your best choice when things conflict. Disadvantages of prima facie relies on people to recognize their own intuition and autonomy. So it does rely on people to be fundamentally good and to recognize that they have choices. It does not promote a single view like absolutism. So people are able to use their agency, their thinking, their logic, their intuition to make these moral judgments. It does not promote one ethical outcome. There is no specific one way to do things, and requires context to make ethical decisions. So you have to look at a broader picture in order to make a moral judgment. And how do we know the fundamental moral rules? So how do we know what's the right thing to do? That's what this question is saying. Conflict. So here's where we get into sometimes these prima facie duties will conflict. When a theory presents multiple principles, it's almost always possible that in certain circumstances, some of those principles will generate conflicting duties. So here are two questions. How do we know what our prima facie duties are? How do we know what to do when our prima facie duties conflict? So for example, if it is our duty to help people in need, and it is also our duty not to harm other people, we might find ourselves in a situation where we can help someone in need by harming someone else. The one duty tells us we ought to do the helping action. The other duty tells us we ought not to do it. So sometimes these things conflict, and we have to make the best choice, knowing the situation, knowing ourselves, and then knowing that these rules are flexible and non-absolutist. So what does prima facie tell us overall? It insists that the fundamental moral rules are self-evident. And so self-evidence means it's that just in case it is true and adequately understanding it is enough to make you justified in believing it. So self-evidence is, it should be somewhat obvious. So certain things like do no harm. Here are some other examples. Lying. Some of the things that we might consider about prima facie duties are something like the 10 Commandments, where they do seem self-evident. Like we generally wouldn't want to lie. We wouldn't want to harm people. But some other examples are mandatory reporting, where we might feel an obligation to not do any harm, but we have an obligation to not share certain types of information, or to share certain types of information depending on the role that we have. And then addiction or homelessness. These are some other examples of how do you help someone who might have an addiction, might be homeless, but you do not have all the answers or the moral ways of dealing with every situation where it doesn't conflict with another. So here's some other examples we can think about. Common examples: our duty to tell the truth, obeying the law, protecting people from harm, and keeping one's promise. So we do have an obligation to tell the truth, both in our workplaces. They probably don't have even written policies that would tell us that we have to tell the truth, but it's implied that we need to be honest, and that we also need to obey the law. I mean, what if everybody ran through stop signs? That would be chaos. Or if people didn't take their obligations to fulfill the law or to follow the law, then that would be essentially anarchy, which some countries do have. And that presents huge problems socially, economically, and politically. So we also have an obligation to protect people from harm. And then keeping one's promise. This might be one that feels a little bit squishy in like, what promises are we supposed to keep versus ones that we can kind of let go of. Like, what if we said we're going to have something due by a particular deadline and we don't keep that obligation? Are we a bad moral person? Probably not. But possibly the thing could be that you just tell somebody, I'm going to be late. But that's a very simple example. So while we might yearn for very formulaic algorithms or prescriptive ways that tell us what to do when prima facie duties conflict and which options should take precedent, it's the actual reality is that it's very often that reasonable minds, different people can and do differ about the right course of action. We see that all the time. We know that an election time is happening, and during that time we hear all sorts of ethical arguments around why we should choose one thing versus another, and only you can make those choices based on your principles and your thinking, your autonomy, and all of these items we're looking for prima facie is what is meaningful and valuable to us. So the role of judgment and autonomy in prima facie is when our fundamental duties conflict, prima facie insists that there's not a mechanical procedure to decide which action is right. Therefore, we must rely on our best judgment and what feels right. So this is very different than some of the absolutist theories because we actually get to think about what we feel is right, and we can choose that. We cannot be certain what's right, and we need the autonomy to choose. So one of the most important principles here is autonomy, that we actually have the agency and autonomy to choose what feels right based on context and what also seems to work in our work life, our personal life, and the situation we're in. Lastly, hard moral choices resist easy solutions. If nothing more that you take away from this presentation is that ethics is hard. Moral choices are hard. Some seem very easy. Some seem very straightforward. But for some people, they might look at things through the same exact principle, but interpret it differently. So I want you, as you make a post to my presentation, I'd like you to consider in your post how you've exercised your prima facie duties or the CAS ethical standards to resolve a particular moral dilemma. And I would like to share my references. I hope you've enjoyed this and take something away from it that is useful to you. And thank you very much.